The announcement of the new survival engineering trial came without warning, delivered in the cold metallic hall of the Galactic Academy, where cadets from dozens of worlds gathered each morning. When the instructors stepped forward, the entire hall grew silent. The head instructor, an elderly Varkune with crystalline skin, held a small transparent box that shimmered under the overhead lights. Inside the box lay countless tiny dark seeds. The instructor explained that the new test would take place on the barren moon Varlon 3, a place known for its thin air, mineral-poor soil, and nearly non-existent water cycle. For decades, the Academy had struggled to find a challenge difficult enough to level the playing field between human cadets and the alien species who relied on natural biological advantages. This time, the Academy believed it had finally found one. Each cadet would receive exactly one seed, identical in size, weight, and genetic composition. The task was to make this seed sprout within 5 days using only the environment and whatever knowledge the cadet possessed. No tools, no technology, no biological enhancements. The cadets simply had to coax life out of a dead world. The room filled with confused murmurs. Several alien cadets exchanged confident glances, certain that the natural compounds in their bodies would allow them to nourish the seed effortlessly. Some species could produce nutrient-rich secretions, others could sense moisture deep underground, and a few could accelerate root growth through harmonic vibrations. But all of them underestimated how hostile Varlon 3 truly was. In the middle of the crowd stood Elias Ward, the only human in the group of 26. He watched the instructors distribute the seeds, each one sealed inside a small capsule. When his turn came, he accepted the capsule quietly and inspected the speck inside. It was almost weightless, as if it held no life at all. The instructor reminded him that the moon had no stable rivers, almost no vegetation, and surface temperatures that swung violently between freezing nights and scorching days. When Elias asked whether the seed was native to the moon or artificially adapted, the instructor simply responded that the seed would require the cadet to understand the environment rather than rely on the seed's design. The answer felt intentionally vague, as if the Academy was testing something more than agricultural skill. When the transport shuttle descended onto the dusty plains of Varlon 3, Elias saw immediately why the instructors seemed so confident in the difficulty of the challenge. The moon stretched endlessly in every direction, a lifeless expanse of pale sand broken only by jagged black rock formations. No clouds drifted overhead. No wind stirred the surface. The air was so thin that every breath felt high and dry, and Elias sensed that any moisture the environment contained was locked away from the surface. As the cadets lined up near the landing zone, each of them received a brief instruction. Find a location anywhere within a 2-kilometer radius, plant the seed, and make it sprout before the deadline. No one could help another cadet, and no cadet could alter the physical structure of the seed. The alien cadets dispersed quickly. A tall Raikari sprinted toward a cluster of boulders, confident that his moisture-tracking senses would locate hidden water. A slender Luvrine cadet walked gracefully across the sand, intent on using her biological nutrient gel to nourish the seed. A bulky Grelorian cadet headed toward the shadow of a large rock arch, believing that a cool, stable temperature would be enough to encourage growth. Elias remained standing for a moment, studying the land rather than rushing forward. He understood something the others did not. If the Academy designed the test to eliminate biological unfairness, then relying on natural species-specific abilities was a trap. The instructors wanted to see creativity, adaptability, and problem-solving. Mechanical advantages were removed. Biological advantages would fail. The only variable left was intellect. Elias crouched down and scooped a handful of sand into his palm. It slipped through his fingers in a dry stream, leaving behind only a faint shimmer of dust. He rubbed the remaining grains between his fingertips and felt how brittle and lifeless they were. Soil like this would never sustain growth without help. As he stood again, He scanned the ground and noticed faint ripples in the sand, as if the surface had been disturbed by something beneath it. He walked several meters toward a small dip in the terrain and knelt again. When he pressed his hand down lightly, the sand felt cooler than the surrounding area. Cooler meant water, or at least the possibility of trapped vapor. The alien cadets had already begun their attempts. Elias glanced at them from a distance. The Raikari cadet had driven his seed deep into the sand and was now spreading his elongated hands wide, attempting to detect underground moisture. The Louvrine cadet held her seed between her palms, secreting a shimmering blue nutrient gel. She lowered it gently into a small nest of sand, as if conducting a sacred ritual. The Grelorian cadet was blowing rhythmic pulses of warm air over his planted seed, convinced that the vibrations would awaken dormant life. Elias watched for several minutes, analyzing the flaws in their approaches. None of them understood the moon's environment. None of them had tested the soil. None of them had searched for the faint signs of microclimates. The Academy had not asked the cadets to create life. It had asked them to understand life well enough to make something almost impossible take root. Elias walked slowly across the plain, observing every dip and rise in the terrain. After nearly an hour of exploration, he understood the land better. The moon's morning fog condensed for only a few minutes each day, forming tiny droplets along the sharp edges of certain rocks before evaporating. The soil beneath these rocks absorbed a small fraction of the moisture, not enough to sustain most life, but perhaps enough for a clever cadet to amplify. Elias found a narrow rock formation with a smooth, slanted surface that faced the direction of the early sunlight. Fog would cling to this surface first. He knelt beside it and placed his hand on the sand. The temperature difference confirmed his suspicion. This spot held the slightest potential for moisture retention. Carefully, he removed the seed from its capsule and held it between his fingers. He could not rely on secretions, biological enhancements, or special senses. He possessed only knowledge, instinct, and the ability to observe what others ignored. He pressed the seed gently into the sand, marking the spot with a small stone. As the sun began to rise higher, he felt the dryness intensifying. The seed would not survive without water, and there was none accessible on the surface. He knew he would need to create a way to capture and preserve whatever moisture the environment offered. But that challenge belonged to the next step. For now, he remained still, watching the other cadets scatter across the barren plain. All of them believed their species-specific abilities would save them. Elias knew better. On a dead world, instinct meant nothing. Only understanding mattered, and he intended to understand Varlon 3 completely. Elias remained beside the slanted rock until the sunlight fully spread across the barren plain, turning the pale sand into a shimmering sheet of heat. The air grew thinner with every passing minute, and the dry, windless stillness made the landscape feel even more lifeless. He stood slowly and examined the area surrounding his chosen spot. The faint cooling he had observed earlier was already fading. If he hoped to keep the seed alive long enough to sprout, he would need to understand not just one small patch of land, but the entire system that allowed even the slightest moisture to exist here. He moved farther from the landing zone, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing any subtle patterns in the sand that might reveal something useful. The terrain shifted gradually from smooth plains to scattered clusters of fractured rock. Some rocks were jagged, as if torn apart by ancient seismic activity, while others were rounded by centuries of thermal expansion and contraction. He touched several rocks to feel how quickly they absorbed and released heat. The smoother stones grew hot immediately, while the darker, jagged ones retained coolness in their crevices. Coolness meant trapping vapor, even in microscopic amounts. As he continued walking, he noticed that the ground dipped into a shallow basin surrounded by half-collapsed ridges. He descended into the basin and felt a faint difference in air temperature. The air here felt marginally less dry, almost imperceptibly heavier. He crouched down and brushed his hand over the sand, watching how the grains clung to his fingertips. This area held moisture, but not in any liquid form. Instead, it seemed as if the sand here absorbed vapor at night and released it when the sun rose. It reminded him of desert environments on Earth, where even the driest dunes could retain traces of water if one knew where to look. The alien cadets continued their frantic attempts in the distance. He could see the Raikari cadet pacing in tight circles, confused that his senses refused to detect anything useful. The Grelorian cadet had begun to sweat under the harsh sunlight, shaking his head in frustration as his seed remained inert in the ground. The Luvrine cadet was kneeling in a meditative pose, holding her hands over the soil as her nutrient gel glimmered faintly. But none of the cadets ventured far from their original planting spots. All of them remained convinced that the environment was stable enough for their biological methods to succeed. Elias knew the environment was anything but stable. The sun's angle changed rapidly on this moon, causing violent shifts in temperature. Cold pockets turned warm within minutes, and any vapor trapped underground escaped before noon. Understanding this pattern became his priority. He walked along the base of the basin's ridge, searching for cracks or fissures large enough to reveal the internal structure of the moon's surface. Eventually, he found a narrow split between two massive rocks where the sand thinned out. He inserted his fingers carefully into the crack, feeling the coolness emanating from below. This crack might lead to a hollow chamber, or at least an air pocket where moisture condensed during the brief hours before dawn. He dug around the edges with his hands, widening the opening just enough to peer inside. The crevice was deeper than he expected. Inside, the walls were coated with a faint layer of frost. He exhaled softly, impressed by how the moon hid its water so effectively. Frost meant potential. Frost meant that under the right conditions, the environment could sustain life, even if the surface screamed otherwise. He needed to determine how the frost formed and how quickly it melted. He decided to observe the crack again at night, when the temperature plunged below freezing. Until then, he continued examining the basin for more clues. He found 4 more areas where the sand felt cooler or slightly heavier. Each spot formed a rough pattern, almost a diagonal line. When he marked the points mentally, it became clear that underground channels of vapor might run beneath the surface. The channels might not carry liquid water, but they shifted moisture in the form of condensed frost. If he could understand the direction of these channels, he could position a system that captured their output. The alien cadets' voices carried faintly across the plain as arguments broke out among them. Several cadets had already begun blaming the academy for an impossible task, insisting that the seed must be defective. Elias ignored the rising frustration and focused on mapping the moisture flow. By midday, the heat became almost unbearable. The twin suns hung directly overhead, baking the ground so fiercely that even the darkest rocks began radiating heat. He retreated into the shadow of a large boulder and drank a small amount of water from his limited supply. He knew he needed to conserve it. He could not waste even a single drop on the seed, because the instructors would observe such a violation immediately. He had to use only what the moon provided. When the temperature finally began to shift, he returned to the shallow basin. The sunlight softened, and the shadows stretched longer across the ground. He watched how the ridges cast asymmetric patterns that cooled certain areas faster than others. The spots that cooled first were always the ones containing the faint traces of moisture he had identified earlier. Cooling meant condensation. Condensation meant opportunity. As evening approached, the alien cadets retreated toward their landing zone tents for rest, frustration evident in their stiff movements and tired gestures. Elias remained in the basin, waiting for the temperature to drop enough for the frost to reappear in the cracks. He pressed his hand against the ground, feeling the slow shift from scorching heat to a deep bone-level chill. Once the air grew cold enough to bite at his exposed fingers, he returned to the first crack he had discovered. The frost had already begun to form again along the inner walls. He watched carefully as the frost spread upward, forming thin, crystalline veins across the rock. The pattern of growth revealed the direction of airflow underground. The air moved slowly from the wider end of the crack toward the narrower one. That meant vapor drifted through the channel in a specific direction. If he could trace that direction across the surface, he could predict where the largest concentration of frost would form by dawn. He followed the implied path, walking steadily despite the dropping temperature. The sky darkened quickly, and the moon's faint stars appeared overhead. When he reached the end of the moisture path, he found himself near a cluster of rocks shaped like a broken spiral. At first he thought the formation was random, but when he knelt down, he felt the sand holding an unusual coolness, far stronger than in the basin. He pushed his fingers into the sand and brushed against something slick. Frost again. This was the strongest point on the entire moisture path. This was where he needed to capture water. The realization filled him with a sharp sense of clarity. The moon was not lifeless. It was simply shy, hiding its water beneath layers of unpredictability. If he could coax the environment into releasing what it concealed, the seed would not only sprout, it would thrive. He stood up carefully, brushing the frost from his fingers. In the distance, the alien cadet slept, unaware that he had already discovered the moon's secret rhythm. Tomorrow he would begin turning that rhythm into a solution. Elias rose early, long before the alien cadets stirred from their tents. The night on Varlon 3 had been brutally cold, and frost coated the rocks around him like a thin, ghostly skin. His breath formed pale clouds in the frigid air. He stood in silence for several moments, absorbing the shifting landscape as the horizon brightened with the first hints of morning light. He needed to act before the sun climbed too high, because the fragile frost he relied on would evaporate within minutes. He walked straight to the spiral-shaped cluster of rocks where he had discovered the strongest concentration of moisture. As he knelt down, he brushed his fingers across the sand to confirm that the frost had thickened overnight. A faint, crunching texture greeted his touch. This was the moment he had been preparing for in his mind ever since he had mapped the moisture path the previous day. He needed to build something capable of capturing the water released during the brief thaw. He searched the surrounding area for materials. Scattered rocks of various sizes lay half buried in the sand. He tested each one by tapping it gently with another stone. Some produced a dull, soft sound, suggesting they were porous and would crumble easily. Others rang sharply, indicating denser, more solid material. He collected the ones that rang sharply, placing them in a growing pile near the spiral formation. The rocks had smooth surfaces that could reflect heat or redirect airflow, both essential functions for what he intended to build. He then removed the small scrap of cloth from his emergency kit. The Academy had allowed each cadet a minimal survival pack consisting of water, cloth, and a protective covering. The cloth was coarse but flexible, and he stretched it out to inspect its weave. The weave was tight enough to trap droplets if held at the right angle. He envisioned a structure that combined reflection, collection, and trapping, a crude fog net and water funnel hybrid. He began by arranging the smooth stones into a semicircle around the moisture point. He tilted them slightly toward the central frost patch, positioning them to reflect the incoming morning heat at a controlled angle. Reflecting too much heat would melt the frost too quickly and cause evaporation. Reflecting too little heat would leave the frost frozen past the optimal collection time. He adjusted each stone with painstaking care, aligning them based on the sun's angle and the shadows cast by the nearby rock clusters. As the sun began to rise, he moved quickly. He anchored the cloth between two sturdy stones, stretching it out like a miniature sail angled toward the ground. He secured the corners by wedging them deep into the sand. When the frost melted, the moisture would drift upward as vapor. The cloth, placed precisely within the airflow path, would trap the vapor as droplets, which would then slide down to the lowest point of the cloth and drip into a small pit he had dug below. This contraption looked primitive, but every piece served a specific purpose. He tested the tension of the cloth, adjusting it slightly to ensure it would not sag too deeply under the weight of the droplets. Then he reinforced the pit by lining it with small stones to prevent the sand from collapsing when wet. Water in this environment was too precious to risk losing. By the time he finished the primary structure, the sunlight began touching the spiral rocks. The frost glistened, tiny crystals sparkling as they softened into beads. He watched the first thin wisp of vapor rise. It curled in the air and drifted toward the cloth. The vapor touched the cloth's underside, clinging to the fibers. Within seconds, tiny droplets formed. Elias leaned in, observing the process with silent satisfaction. The system worked. It worked exactly as he had imagined. He stepped back to avoid casting a shadow, giving the system room to function. While it collected water, he decided to expand his design. The more water he could harvest, the better chance his seed would have, especially since he planned to build a controlled microenvironment for sprouting it. He returned to the base of the basin and searched for more rock shapes that could serve as additional collectors. He found 2 long, flat slabs partially buried in the sand. After digging them out, he positioned them on either side of the primary device, forming narrow channels that guided airflow toward the cloth. The channels altered the windless stillness in a subtle way, funneling the smallest temperature differences toward the collection zone. Even the faintest currents mattered here. He pressed his ear close to the cracks between the rocks, listening to the low hum of shifting air under the surface. The underground vapor moved slowly but predictably. Soon the droplets on the cloth grew large enough to slide downward. They gathered at the lowest point, merged, and finally released, dripping into the pit with a soft tapping sound. He stared at the tiny pool forming at the bottom. Each drop was a victory. Each drop carried the potential for growth. Satisfied that the system was stable, he turned his attention to creating a nutrient blend for the seed. He walked toward the edge of a nearby crater he had noticed the previous day. He had not approached it earlier because he had been focused on moisture, but now he needed more information. He descended carefully into the crater, feeling the shift in temperature as he moved deeper. The floor of the crater was covered in a fine mineral powder that shimmered faintly. He scooped some of it into his palm and rubbed it between his fingers. It felt different from the sand, finer, richer in certain elements. He examined it closely and noticed specks of silver and green embedded in the powder. These minerals could help stabilize pH levels and provide essential nutrients to a developing root. He collected enough of the powder to fill a small pouch in his survival pack, then climbed back out of the crater with cautious steps to avoid dislodging loose rocks. When he returned to his moisture collection device, the pit had accumulated a shallow but usable amount of water. He mixed the mineral powder with a small portion of the captured water, stirring it until the liquid grew thick and slightly metallic in scent. The mixture reminded him of nutrient solutions used in hydroponic systems back on Earth, albeit far cruder. He knelt beside the spot where he had planted the seed the day before. The sand had gone dry again during the night, but now he had something that could improve the seed's chances. He dug gently, widening the initial hole around the seed without disturbing its position. He poured the mixture into the pit slowly, allowing it to soak into the sand. Then he covered the seed again with a thin layer. He understood that the seed would need more than water and nutrients. It would need protection from the violent temperature swings. He placed several stones around the planting spot, creating a pocket of shade that would shield it from the harshest sunlight. He then positioned a reflective slab behind the stones to redirect a controlled amount of light into the shaded area, ensuring the seed would stay warm enough to survive, but not hot enough to burn. By the time the suns reached their peak, he had built a functioning microenvironment designed to regulate heat, channel moisture, and nourish the seed. He sat back, exhausted but focused, watching the reflection of sunlight bounce softly against the stone circle. The alien cadets would not understand what he had done, not yet. They were still trying to overpower the environment with their biological abilities. Elias had chosen a different approach. He had decided to cooperate with the moon rather than fight it. He remained beside his creation for the rest of the afternoon, observing every detail. As shadows shifted, he adjusted stones. As windless air warmed, he modified angles. When droplets slowed in the pit, he inspected the cloth to ensure the tension remained correct. The system was delicate, but it worked as long as he guided it. By evening, he leaned forward and touched the soil above the seed. It held a faint hint of moisture. It was enough. It was the first sign that life on this dead moon might begin with his hands. Elias woke before dawn again, though this time his mind was not burdened with uncertainty. He moved with calm determination as he approached the spiral rock formation, eager to see how much water his system had collected during the night. The temperature was still low enough for the frost to cling stubbornly to the stones, and he inhaled deeply as the cold air tightened around his chest. The sky overhead shifted from deep violet to a pale lavender, promising the brief window when the frost began to melt. He crouched beside the cloth net and examined the pit beneath it. A thin but noticeable layer of water shimmered faintly in the faint light. He touched the edge of the pit with one fingertip, testing the moisture. It was clean, cold, and pure. He allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction before he stood and began preparing to expand his work. If the seed survived the first infusion of nutrients, he would need to move from simple maintenance to actual cultivation. His first task was to build a broader network of moisture funnels. The earlier channels he had carved redirected airflow, but now he would require more surface area to trap vapor. He searched the landscape for additional materials, determined to increase the efficiency of his design. He walked along the northern ridge, studying the shapes of larger boulders. Some had naturally smooth faces that curved gently, while others were cracked in jagged, chaotic lines. He placed his hands on each rock he encountered, feeling the temperature on its surface and imagining how it would react to morning sunlight. Eventually, he found a rock with a long, flat surface that tilted at a shallow angle. He struck it with a smaller stone to test its integrity. The sharp metallic ring told him it was dense enough to hold its structure even under changing temperatures. With significant effort, he managed to dislodge it from the sand and tilt it upright. He positioned the slab to reflect sunlight toward the spiral formation during the earliest hours of the day. The slab would warm the frost just enough to encourage melting without causing vapor to escape too rapidly. Once he secured it firmly in the sand, he stepped back to inspect his new arrangement. The reflective slab extended the reach of his system, guiding the thawing process along a wider path. As the sun rose higher, the frost began dissolving. He watched with sharp attention as the vapor drifted upward and gathered on the cloth. Droplets formed quickly, then slid downward in steady streams. The pit collected water at nearly twice the previous rate. The improvement filled him with cautious hope. Water alone, however, would not be enough. He needed to ensure the seed could anchor itself in this hostile world. He returned to the spot where the seed was buried, kneeling beside the ring of stones that shielded it. The soil looked slightly darker than the surrounding sand, proof that last night's nutrient mixture had begun to permeate deeper into the ground. He touched the soil gently. It held moisture, just enough. He brushed away the top layer slowly, careful not to disturb the seed itself, and his breath caught when he spotted it. A barely visible split along the seed's outer shell. A small, pale root protruded from the fissure like the first hesitant breath of something new. The sight filled him with a quiet but powerful sense of achievement. Against all odds, the seed had awakened. Instead of celebrating, he immediately began planning. A sprouting seed was incredibly vulnerable. The temperature swings could kill it. The sunlight could scorch it. The dry wind could strip it of moisture before it grew strong enough to survive on its own. He needed to expand the protective structure he had built. He gathered more stones, arranging them into a wider circle around the initial ring. He placed each stone carefully, adjusting their angles to create a layered shield. The outer layer blocked direct sunlight, while the inner layer trapped warmth. The gap between the layers allowed airflow, preventing the interior from overheating. He then added smaller stones above the seed, forming a loose canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, diffused glow. This would mimic the gentle light conditions required for early root development. Once the protective structure was secure, he studied the ground around it. A sprout would need room to grow, which meant the soil must hold moisture for longer periods. He dug shallow channels from the moisture collection device to the seed's location, carving curving paths that would allow excess water to seep gently toward the planting spot. The channels were narrow and subtle, designed not to collapse during temperature shifts. By the time he finished shaping the network of channels, the sun had climbed high enough to force him back toward the shade. He retreated behind a tall boulder and drank a small amount of water, careful not to deplete his supply. From the shade, he observed the alien cadets scattered across the plain. The Raikari cadet knelt in frustration, his hands pressed to the ground as if pleading with the soil to respond. The Luvrine cadet walked slowly in circles, carrying her wilted sprout in her palms, whispering soothing sounds that did nothing to revive it. The Grelorian cadet sat still, exhausted and defeated, staring at the stubborn patch of sand that refused to accept his efforts. None of them noticed Elias watching. None of them understood why his approach succeeded while theirs failed. He turned away, unwilling to let their frustration distract him from the fragile life he had created. He returned to the seed and waited. The sun moved steadily across the sky, and he adjusted stones and channels as shadows changed. When the heat became unbearable, he shielded his face with his hands but remained at his post. Hours drifted by slowly. Finally, when the suns began their descent and the shadows grew long again, he noticed a faint change in the soil. The split in the seed had widened. The root had extended deeper, anchoring itself with determination. As the temperature dropped, he checked the surrounding stones to ensure the structure held enough warmth for the night. He reinforced several areas with smaller rocks and packed the sand tightly against the base of the stone wall to prevent cold air from seeping through. When the darkness settled fully, he returned once more to the spiral formation to observe the frost. The underground channels he had mapped glimmered faintly as vapor condensed along the rock walls. He knelt in silence, absorbing every detail of the process. He understood then that he no longer needed to fight the moon's environment. He could guide it, shape it gently, coax it into cooperation. He walked back to the seed and sat beside it, watching the night sky unfold above him. The stars shimmered like distant fires. The moonscape felt cold and vast, yet within the small circle of stones he had built, something fragile and hopeful began to take root. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the faint pulse of the changing air. The seed was alive. The system worked, and tomorrow he would make it grow. Elias remained awake for most of the night, adjusting the stones around the sprout and monitoring the formation of frost across the spiral cluster. By the time the first pale streaks of dawn touched the horizon, his body felt stiff from exhaustion, yet his mind held a sharp, steady clarity. This would be the final day of the trial. He knew the instructors would arrive by sunset to evaluate the results. The alien cadets would present wilted sprouts or empty patches of sand. He intended to present something entirely different. He stood and stretched his cramped limbs before walking toward the protective circle that held the young plant. He knelt slowly and brushed the sand aside. A small shoot had broken through the soil. It stood fragile and pale, trembling slightly in the morning air. He allowed himself a brief moment of quiet awe. This was no longer just a seed. It was life made visible, a declaration of possibility on a world that had forgotten how to grow. The responsibility settled heavily on him. One sprout would not be enough to survive the harsh terrain. He needed to strengthen it, multiply it, and create an environment that supported sustained growth, something that would demonstrate not only survival, but mastery. He began by expanding the water grid. The earlier channels he had carved were small and conservative, designed to guide moisture toward a single point. Now, he needed more. He traced a wider pattern in the sand, marking the directions where underground vapor flows were strongest. He then carved new channels, each deeper than the original ones, and reinforced them with stones to prevent collapse. Some channels curved elegantly around rock formations and rejoined the main path near the seed. Others branched outward, forming a delicate web. When sunlight hit the spiral formation, the frost melted quickly and vapor drifted into the cloth net in soft swirls. Droplets formed in abundance. The pit began filling at a rate he had not seen before. The grid was working with greater power now, feeding more water into the channels. He watched the first trickle reach the base of the sprout, darkening the soil in a slow, spreading pattern. He allowed himself a quiet breath of relief before he began the next step. A single plant could not demonstrate the full potential of his approach, but a cluster could. A grove could. A forest, small, young, and fragile, would prove that he had not simply made a seed sprout. He had turned an unforgiving world into a place that could sustain life. He returned to the crater that held the mineral-rich powder. He climbed down carefully, collecting more powder into makeshift pouches. Then he walked to a ridge where the sunlight struck the ground intensely. He noticed new cracks forming in the soil here, cracks caused by rapid temperature shifts. Within these cracks, he found dust that glittered with silvery flecks, heavier minerals that could enrich the soil further. He mixed the minerals with sand in a wide, shallow bowl made from a curved stone slab, adding water from the growing pit until the mixture formed a thick, nourishing paste. This paste would act as growth medium for the new cuttings he planned to propagate. He returned to the sprout, studying its tiny stem and leaves. It had grown almost imperceptibly since dawn, but its structure was strong enough to allow careful handling. He used 2 thin stones to clip a small segment of the sprout, ensuring he did not harm the main stem. He placed the cutting into the mineral paste and tucked it under the cooled shade of another stone ring he had built in advance. Then he repeated the process, creating several identical protective circles around the original plant. Each circle held a cutting coated in the nutrient mixture. He positioned each one within reach of the expanded water channels. If all cuttings survived, the grove would be noticeable by evening. A forest in miniature. A demonstration of biological engineering through understanding rather than force. He worked tirelessly through the heat of midday, adjusting the angles of stones, widening the channels when needed, and shading the cuttings from the harshest light. He drank only when necessary. He moved with focus so intense that he barely noticed the alien cadets watching him from afar. At some point, the Raikari cadet approached him, confusion etched across his face. He asked a question that trembled with disbelief. Elias responded only by pointing at the land, at the stones, at the channels. The cadet stared, uncomprehending, and eventually walked away. Elias returned to his work without hesitation. The alien cadets saw only actions. Elias understood the invisible relationships beneath them. Temperature gradients, vapor flow, mineral content, and heat reflection. By late afternoon, the first cutting began to form a root. Then another, and another. The sight of the young roots burrowing eagerly into the lightly moistened soil filled him with a sense of triumph deeper than anything he had felt in the academy so far. He positioned small reflective stones around each new sprout to distribute heat evenly and protect them from the cooling breeze that stirred at dusk. He then widened the shade structures to ensure no sudden drop in temperature would harm the fragile growth. When the suns dipped toward the horizon, the instructors finally arrived, descending in a sleek vessel that cast long shadows across the sand. The alien cadets hurried toward the landing zone, each carrying what remained of their efforts. Some held wilted sprouts cupped in disappointment. Others carried empty capsules, ashamed to present failure. The instructors evaluated each cadet in turn. The responses ranged from sympathy to stern disappointment, depending on how each cadet had approached the challenge. When Elias's turn came, he did not walk toward the instructors. Instead, He gestured for them to follow him. The instructors exchanged doubtful glances, but agreed. He led them across the landscape he had shaped. He showed them the reflective slabs guiding sunlight. He showed them the cloth net brimming with droplets. He showed them the channels that carried water like veins across the plains. And then he revealed the grove. A cluster of young shoots rose timidly from the soil, each protected by carefully arranged stones. The original sprout stood in the center, taller than the others, its stem firm and its leaves reaching upward as though greeting the fading light. The instructors stared in stunned silence. One of them knelt and touched the soil. It was moist, warm, alive. Another picked up a stone and examined the channels. Another stood frozen, unable to speak. Elias stepped back, giving them space to absorb what they were seeing. The trial had not asked for a forest. It had asked for a sprout. Elias had given them an ecosystem. After several long moments, the head instructor approached him. His crystalline skin reflected the golden light as he spoke. His voice, usually cold and formal, now trembled with awe. He explained that the Academy had designed the trial to expose limits, not to inspire creation. Yet Elias had demonstrated something far more valuable, the ability to transform an environment through understanding, patience, and ingenuity. The instructor declared him the highest-scoring cadet in the history of the trial. The decision was unanimous, but the true reward did not come from the recognition. It came from the landscape itself. As night settled over Varlon 3, a faint breeze carried the scent of young leaves. The trees, small as they were, rustled softly in the moonlight. Life had taken root. Elias stood beside the grove, watching the instructors depart. The alien cadets gathered at a distance, staring at what he had built. He felt no need to speak. The grove spoke for him. He had shown that even a dead world could breathe again when approached with respect and intelligence. He walked slowly around the forest he had created, touching each stone and each sprout as if committing them to memory. He knew the Academy would protect this grove, study it, and perhaps even expand it. But no matter what happened next, he had already accomplished something lasting.